We'd like to welcome Dr. Brent Glass.
Good afternoon. I'm Brent Glass, Director Emeritus of the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, and also Senior Advisor and co-founder of the National History Academy. I'm delighted to welcome you to a virtual field trip to Gettysburg National Military Park. And I know you're going to enjoy your tour with Barbara Sanders, who I will introduce in a moment. The National History Academy is dedicated to providing history education to middle and high school students throughout the country and to students in other countries who are interested and share a passion for American history. We believe that one of the best ways to learn about American history is by visiting historic places and to be inspired by the power of place and the stories about the people and the events and the places that have shaped American history. The Academy is in its entering into its fourth year, and we're very pleased to be able to offer these virtual field trips to our audiences across the country through Facebook. We have recorded these field trips, and if you've missed any, you can go to our Facebook page and find and catch up with the previous field trips. We are now going to be visiting Gettysburg Battlefield, and before I introduce our guest, I just want to mention that next week at 4 o'clock on Wednesday, we'll be visiting the National Museum of Industrial History in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. So please put that on your calendar. Gettysburg Battlefield is arguably one of the most significant historic sites in America. And we're very pleased that Barbara Sanders is going to be our guide. She is the National Military Park's education specialist, and she's held that position since 1999, where she oversees thousands of students visiting the park each year, both in person and through virtual field trips. In addition, the park annually offers professional development opportunities for teachers, classroom, as well as classroom loan materials and more. Barbara was the educator on the project team for the planning and construction of the Visitor Center and Museum at Gettysburg, which included the concept and design for the exhibits, films, and computer interactive elements. Barbara started her career at museums in Philadelphia, and then she moved to Washington, D.C., where she earned a Master of Arts in Teaching degree from George Washington University's Museum Education Program. She was recently awarded the National Park Service Northeast Region's Freeman Tilden Award, which recognizes creativity, advancement, and ingenuity in the field. Barbara, we're very happy to have you lead us on this tour of Gettysburg Battlefield.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. And we're going to do this afternoon a version of a virtual field trip that we do for students all across the country. We now have 10 virtual field trips, and they're based in primary source documents, and they're based in this place, and they're based around a central focus question. And today you're going to be watching a short film of a small portion of the battlefield, the National Cemetery and the area around it, because we're going to be taking a tour really of the aftermath of the Battle of Gettysburg. What happened when those guns fell silent, and what meaning can we place upon that? So we're going to be taking a tour of ideas, taking a tour of some artifacts, and taking a tour of many of the people that you're going to be introduced to in this film. And we're just always happy to work with the National History Academy because we all believe in that power of place. And this is certainly a very powerful place to be. I bet many of you have been here before. We hope many of you will come back again. So let's watch this short pre-programmed film that students watch when they're preparing to participate in this our cost of war virtual field trip. And I'll see you on the other side.
Hi, I'm Barb Sanders, a park ranger here at Gettysburg National Military Park, and I'm standing on East Cemetery Hill, a key defensive position for the Union Army on the second and third days of the battle. It's a cold day when we're filming today, but July 1st through 3rd, 1863 were very hot and humid when this action was taking place. The Battle of Gettysburg was in the middle of a long, drawn-out war where over 700,000 men lost their lives. Many people after this battle were asking the question, why? Why does all this death and destruction have to happen, have to continue? Today, we're going to explore our focus question. Was all the death and destruction of the Civil War necessary to achieve the war goals? Today, we're going to answer the question from the perspective of 4 people involved in and affected by the Battle of Gettysburg. The first person, Elizabeth Thorne, lived just across the street in the cemetery gatehouse. She was the caretaker for the Evergreen Cemetery. Let's go over there now and review her story. Elizabeth Thorne was from Germany, as was her husband Peter. At the time of the Battle of Gettysburg, Peter was off fighting elsewhere for the Union Army, and it was left to Elizabeth to take care of this local town cemetery, as well as her aging parents and her 3 young sons. She was also 6 months pregnant with their 4th child. How would Elizabeth have answered the question, was all of this death and destruction worth it? Well, her experience was troubling. She was kicked out of her house. It was used as a headquarters. It was also used as a hospital. This battle, the Battle of Gettysburg, over the course of 3 days, left in its wake 51,000 casualties, killed, wounded, and captured soldiers. The wounded soldiers were taken care of in many of the homes and churches of the town, including Elizabeth's home, the cemetery gatehouse. Here's a small bit of what she faced when she tried to return to the house with her father to get some of their things. Father and I tried to go into the house, but we were stopped. We were told wounded men were inside and that we should make no light, as it might make the wounded soldiers restless. We said we would get what we wanted without light, and we felt around. Father got a shawl, and I a quilt. When Elizabeth did return to the house finally, it was not the home that she had known. She said everything in the house was gone except 3 feather beds and a couple of pillows. The beds and a dozen pillows we had brought from the old country were not fit to use again. The legs of 6 soldiers had been amputated on the beds in our house, and they were ruined with blood, and we had to make way with them. So that's some of the consequences of this one battle in the middle of the Civil War, the wounded soldiers. What about the dead? What happened to them? Elizabeth and her father ended up burying 105 of the initial dead here in the local town cemetery. Here's how she described it. It was a busy time for Father and me when we got back. We would get orders to dig graves, and Father and I dug 105 for soldiers in the next 3 weeks. When I left home for the first time, I had put on a heavier dress than usual, and when we got back, there wasn't a single piece of our clothing left. I lived in that dress for 6 weeks. Elizabeth Thorne had a very troubling time during and after the Battle of Gettysburg. She must have asked herself the question, was it all worth it? We're going to now go across the Iron Gate fence to the Soldiers' National Cemetery that was created here in Gettysburg for many of the other fallen, to explore the stories of 2 of the soldiers buried there. I'm standing now in the Soldiers' National Cemetery at Gettysburg, inside the Minnesota plot, the plot where the men from Minnesota who died at this battle, many of them, are buried. One of those soldiers is Philip Rice Hamlin. Philip Rice Hamlin lived on a farm in Minnesota. He had an older brother who was off fighting in another theater of war, and younger brothers. And his letters home, he often writes to his younger brothers, giving them advice on how to live and how to carry on. He also speaks in those letters about why he is fighting in this war. He talks of freedom. He talks about being a beacon of light for other countries around the world. He talks about fighting for God and his country. On the evening that he died, July the 3rd, 1863, one of his comrades wrote an account of his burial out on those fields of battle. He said, Private J. Wright, "As we drank our coffee, we decided to bury Hamlin that night. Search was made for a spade, and after some time a shovel was found. With this, a shallow trench was dug beside a walnut tree, near which he had been killed, struck by 4 bullets. His blanket and tent cloth were spread in it, and he was then laid upon them and covered with the remaining portions. Then those present knelt in silence about him, with uncovered, bowed heads. I do not recall that a word was spoken, but it was a sincere and reverential service fitting the time and situation. Then we covered him over with the dirt and stones we had thrown out of the trench, and placed at his head a board on which his name, company, and regiment had been marked." Philip Hamlin gave his life for his country. How would he have answered that question? Was this death and destruction worth it? Another soldier who identified freedom and country as his reason for fighting was Sid Carter, and he, we think, is buried in the Connecticut plot just next door. Let's go there now and learn more about him. I'm standing now in the Connecticut plot of the Soldiers National Cemetery and at the grave of S. Carter. But there was no S. Carter from a Connecticut regiment here at the Battle of Gettysburg. Perhaps this is Sid Carter from the 15th South Carolina Infantry, who was mortally wounded and taken to the Lutheran Theological Seminary Hospital after the first day of battle. His body was never found. What do we know about Sid Carter from South Carolina? Well, we know he was a loving husband to his wife, Bet, and he wrote her letters as often as he could, asking about their farm and asking about their 3 children, Horace, Ida, and Minnie Carter. We know he was a good father. He was very concerned to hear of his children's illnesses and what they were doing and how they were growing up while he was away at war. We also know that Sid Carter owned slaves. He owned a small farm in South Carolina, and he often gave his wife, Bet, advice on how to handle that farm, including the enslaved persons living there with them. So why was Sid Carter fighting in the war? Well, I'm going to read an excerpt from a letter that he wrote to Bet, where he tells her exactly what he was fighting for. On January 4th of 1862, he wrote of the first time he opened fire on another human being. He said, "It felt right curious until they came up where I could see them good and we were ordered to fire. And then it was the first time in my life that I had raised my gun to shoot a human being like myself." He went on to say, and close the letter, "Give my love to all and accept your own part. Kiss the dear little ones for me. If I never see them again, I will try to leave them a free home." How is it that Sid Carter, who owned slaves, identified a free home as something he was fighting for? Was his definition for freedom, certainly it was, very different from that of Philip Hamlin's definition for freedom and others? This war can often be seen as a war being fought to determine which path our country was going to take, which definition of freedom it was going to follow. How would Sid Carter have answered that focus question for today? Was all this death and destruction worth it? What would it ultimately achieve? Our final stop today in the National Cemetery is as close to the spot as we can possibly come to the location of President Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address in November of that year. Follow me now to that spot. The Soldiers' National Monument behind me stands at the center of the semicircle of Civil War graves. It's also very near the location of the platform for the November 19th, 1863 dedication ceremony. The speaker for that day, one of the speakers for that day, was President Abraham Lincoln. He was not the main speaker. The main speaker was a man who spoke for 2 hours about the Battle of Gettysburg in very vivid detail. President Lincoln, on the other hand, spoke for just over 2 minutes. He delivered a 10-sentence address. He came to the ceremony because he felt, as Commander-in-Chief, he should be here, despite the fact that he had a sick son at home and had lost another son earlier in the war. Lincoln decided to make the trip to Gettysburg from Washington, D.C., because he had a message that he wanted to get out to the country. He was Commander-in-Chief. The war had been going on for well over 2 years, and people were asking the question, was this destruction and loss of life worth it? For what purpose are we still involved in this war? And he had answers to those questions. In his 10-sentence Gettysburg Address, just 272 words, he tried to answer those questions. He tried to get people further behind the war effort. He began his speech by referring to what he considered to be the founding document of the country, the Declaration of Independence. A lot of people know that first sentence. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. But it's his last sentence, the 10th sentence, that really we should be focusing on. Because in that 10th sentence, he's responding to why we are in this war and what this war can resolve. I'll read it for you now. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. How would Abraham Lincoln have answered the question, was this war worth it? Was all this death and destruction at the Battle of Gettysburg worth it? Let's go now to our final stop to review the answers of this question for our 4 individuals today and to begin to explore your answer to that question. The American Civil War resulted in the loss of over 700,000 lives. It also eventually led to the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the United States Constitution. Today, we looked at the consequences of this one battle, the Battle of Gettysburg, to 4 individuals. We looked at Elizabeth Thorne, the loss of her house, and her work and struggles to bury 105 of the initial dead in the local town cemetery. We looked at 2 of the dead buried in this cemetery, Sergeant Philip Hamlin of the 1st Minnesota, and Sid Carter from the 15th South Carolina. We also explored Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, those 10 sentences that he delivered to dedicate the Soldiers' National Cemetery. And I'm asking you now to review those documents more fully and to answer the question, were the consequences of war, including the destruction and loss of life at Gettysburg, necessary to resolve the country's issues? How would these 4 individuals have answered that question? How would you answer that question?
Okay. So that was a very cold day when we filmed that. It's a very warm day in Gettysburg today. And we're going to be pondering a little bit more our focus question. But first, I wanted to share my screen and show you where I am currently seated and how that's in comparison to the National Cemetery. There we go. Hoping everybody can see that. Okay, so the Gettysburg Campaign, the full campaign, was from June 3rd to July the 3rd, the last day of the battle, 1863, right there in the middle of the war. What was at stake in this war? If you look at this campaign map, you may notice a number of things. One is the blue arrows are showing you from which direction the Union Army descended upon Gettysburg, and they came up from the south. And the red arrows are showing you from which direction the Confederate Army, the Army of Northern Virginia, arrived in Gettysburg. And look, they went up and over the mountain range and came in from the north. Gettysburg had any number of roads, at least 12 different roads that came into this small town of 2,400 people. And that road network was very important for carrying the soldiers, their equipment, the cannon, the carriages, everything that they would need. So it wasn't planned to have a battle at this town. It was the county seat of Adams County, but it wasn't planned to have a battle. It was a farming community, and those road networks brought everyone in. The other thing that is interesting about when we look at it from this bird's eye view in a campaign map is this line right here that separates Pennsylvania from Maryland. So you may know that that is also known as the Mason-Dixon line. And so what was legal below the Mason-Dixon line, what was illegal above the Mason-Dixon line? And of course, I'm talking about the institution of slavery. And so many people don't know how very close we are. There's, in fact, quite a bit of Underground Railroad activity right up here in the Gettysburg area. And from the fields of Pickett's Charge, you can see that mountain range, and you can see over into Maryland, very, very close indeed. So there were a lot of things at stake in this battle. This was a battle on northern soil. The Union Army was going to be defending its territory. And if General Lee would not have been turned back here, he could have gone on to Harrisburg or changed the whole course of the war, taking the war out of the South. So where am I on this map? This is a map of July the 2nd, 1863. And you can begin to see, here's the town of Gettysburg again. You can begin to see this fishhook formation of the Union Army, or inverted candy cane. You can begin to see the attacks on that second day of the battle from the Confederate Army. They had what was called an exterior line, less men, about 75,000 men all told, and they were going to have to attack the Union line, the interior line, more men in the Union Army, about 95,000 men. Where I'm located, our visitor center complex is right inside the crook of the fishhook, right inside here, just off the Baltimore Pike. And that's where my office is today. The cemetery is on Cemetery Hill, the Soldiers National Cemetery, just about a quarter mile from behind my office. So here again, we have our focus questions for today. It's one of those what if questions. It's not an easy one to answer, but an interesting one to ponder. What were the consequences of war, including the destruction and loss of life at Gettysburg, necessary to resolve the country's issues? So the short answer to that is they had found a way for decades to avoid war and to come to compromises as the country was expanding west, and they were determining what each new state as they entered, whether they were a slave state or a free state, how that was going to be dealt with. But ultimately, after the election of President Abraham Lincoln, the southern states, of course, began to secede one by one, and war broke out at Fort Sumter. And it got to the point where, you can't really compromise any longer on an issue like slavery. Either you think it's right or you think it's wrong. And by the time of the Battle of Gettysburg, this was a long war, been going on over 2 years, and no one knew when it was going to end. Just want to go over a couple of things, and then we're going to open everything up to questions today. And that is some of the costs of war. We talked a little bit about it in the film, I wanted to introduce you to a couple of other people before we take those questions. I want to make sure everybody knows what a casualty is. A lot of people think a casualty is dead. There are at least 3 categories of casualties. This one battle that lasts, again, from July 1st through 3rd, 1863, left in its wake 51,000 casualties. That included dead, wounded, and captured or missing. This is a famous photograph of 3 Confederate captured here at the Battle of Gettysburg. This is once again Philip Hamlin, that soldier that we met from the 1st Minnesota. And he wrote a lot of letters, and we only talked about a couple of excerpts from those letters in the film there. He wrote extensively throughout his service, wrote back home to his family, and often expressed why he was fighting and why he felt the war was necessary. Here's an excerpt from a letter he wrote to his younger brother on January 20th, 1863. God willing, I hope to meet you again on earth, but on the other hand, I know that you may someday hear that Philip is dead, and know that I have fallen in battle and been buried in a strange land where you may never see my grave. But hoping for different things, I bid you goodbye. And indeed, we heard Philip Hamlin's burial account. He was buried on a strange land, but he was properly identified and moved to the Soldiers National Cemetery. Wondering how his family back in Minnesota would have answered our focus question today, because they not only lost Philip here at the Battle of Gettysburg, but they lost another son in 1864 near Nashville. Sid Carter was the soldier. We don't have a photo of Sid Carter. This is the building that was used as both a Union and Confederate hospital and the Lutheran Theological Seminary, where he was treated and where we think that he died. But there is no definitive answer as to where his body lay, as you saw in that film. This is a little bit more from the letter that we heard about. I think it was the same letter that he wrote to his wife, Bet, in 1861. He's trying to comfort her. He's saying, Bet, you must meet trouble halfway, for if I was not born to be killed by the Yankees, all the Yankees can't hurt me. And if they kill me in battle, remember, I am fighting for God and my country. When I think about being killed and leaving you and my dear little children, it nerves me, for I feel like I'm in the right and will come through safe and sound. It makes me mad to look at them walking on the soil of South Carolina. So this, of course, is early in the war when all of the battles are being fought in the South. And Sid Carter and Philip Hamlin reminds me of one of the costs of war, and that is the loss of sons, the loss of fathers. So many, North and South, so many families going through this, not knowing when they're going to, or if they were ever going to hear from a loved one again. This is another soldier we didn't talk about in the film. He was quite a poet. His name was Edmund Dascombe, and he wrote quite a bit of poetry. And he's buried in the Soldiers National Cemetery, but we do have one of his full poems, and you see 2 stanzas from it here, and it's called The Cost of War. And he goes through all those all the different costs of what battle and war, the damage to the land, the wounded, the difficult emotional strain on soldiers. And in these 2 stanzas, we hear he's talking about the price that we pay. The price we pay is truly great for freedom's precious boon, but cheap is this at any cost, save to the base poltroon. Disaster's dark, uncertain hour soon shows the coward knave, who for a chance to breathe a while would yield and be a slave. So if anybody would like that copy of his whole poem, where he lays out all the costs and what he feels was worth, that he feels those costs were difficult but were worth it, I'd be happy to share that. Elizabeth Thorne, we met. We saw you saw a close-up of that beautiful statue of her that is now next to the gatehouse inside the Evergreen Cemetery. And this is the same quote that you heard in the film, I think it bears repeating. Here's a woman 6 months old with little children, with aging parents, with a husband away, fighting for his new country. Both of them were German immigrants. And the last line of that quote gets me every time. She lived in that dress for 6 weeks. Many of you may have heard of Cornelia Hancock. She was a young woman from New Jersey who heard that New Jersey soldiers were in this big battle in Pennsylvania, and she got on a train and came to serve as a nurse. Women as nurses early in the war, they were considered too delicate, but they showed that they were anything but, and Cornelia Hancock certainly showed that she was anything but delicate. She served at the Second Corps Hospital here in Gettysburg for several weeks. And then when all of the hospitals were consolidated to one general hospital called Camp Letterman, comprised of tents east of town, she was there until that hospital closed its doors 2 days after Lyndon's Gettysburg Address on November 21st, 1863. And in her letters home, she describes in great detail her daily schedule, all that she's doing for the soldiers, and all of the changes that she's going through. And at one point, she's talking about the wounded. Early on, when she gets here, she says she doesn't mind the sight of blood, but she cannot bear to take down the letters home to the hurt soldiers or the dying soldiers back home. That's too much for her to bear. By the time of August, September, October, she says she could watch them cut a man's head off and it wouldn't bother her anymore. She's just been exposed to so much. And the idea of the cost of war to the nation as a whole, the innocence is gone, everybody's seen so much, and also the long-term effects on the wounded. Sometimes we look at consequences and we say, okay, they didn't die, they were just wounded. But amputation was the most common surgery throughout the course of the war, and it was a consequence that would need to be dealt with for the remainder of they and their families' lives. And this is just some of the examples of how that common and surgery and that saved a life could just, in a time when you needed to earn your living with manual labor, often in factory or on farm, this could be devastating, of course. What you see here is a small portion of the 1860 census here in Gettysburg, and I draw your attention to the middle area right here that details in 1860 the Abram Bryant family, his wife Elizabeth, and 2 sons, Francis and William. They lived in a small white house right at the center of the Union line. It would suffer extensive damage during Pickett's charge July 3rd, 1863, at the close of the battle. By that time, the Bryant family had fled their home, and you can probably tell why if you look closely at this census. The Bryant family were Black. So they were African Americans living just above the Mason-Dixon line, but with a property ownership of, this is the value of their home, $1,400. They would leave when the Confederate Army came north and would put in for claims to damage that really wouldn't get that much back from the battle. So he suffered, the Bryant family, a literal cost during this battle. And yet I wonder how he would have answered the question, was it all worth it, the death and destruction? This is a famous photograph as well of the Trousseau Farm, and it just shows you a little bit about what Gettysburg, now a beautiful park and place where people today, especially such a beautiful day, are taking walks and runs and having their kids get outside and climb on the rocks at Devil's Den and all these sorts of things. But it was anything but a beautiful place in the days, weeks, and months after the battle. And the Trousseau Farm damage here, right in the just down from the peach orchard, shows you some of that with the dead horses and the destruction of property. This is an inset of the burial map that was created after the battle by a doctor to mark all the hash marks that you can see on there. If you look very, very closely, shows one of the graves or trench graves out on the fields. So the initial graves, as you heard Philip Hamlin's comrades, were out on the field before they had decided to create the National Cemetery, and they used this map to then go out and find those trench graves, re-identify those soldiers or identify those soldiers based on things found in their pockets. They were not issued dog tags at that time, and bring them into right here is where the Soldiers National Cemetery was created, and you can see the half circle of those graves and that central monument, the Soldiers National Monument. A couple of artifacts just before we open it up for questions here. This is a broadside or a poster. This speaks to, again, the cost of war, how horrible it was after the battle. The broadside was put up all over the town looking for proposals for the removal of the dead. You can see David Wills has signed, also Governor Curtin of Pennsylvania. David Wills, the David Wills home is in a museum now on the center square. That's where President Lincoln spent the night and where he finished and wrote out a clean copy of the Gettysburg Address prior to its delivery on November 19, 1863. And this is some of the burial detail. They're over in Hanover at this point. Samuel Weaver was the head of that detail, and a large portion of the African-American population of Gettysburg came in at the lowest bid under Samuel Weaver to go out, and you can see we have they have ropes and hooks to remove those bodies and try to identify them, put them inside War Department coffins, and mark their graves as best they could. And finally, when we think about was it worth it? Was all the death and destruction at Gettysburg worth it? I'm often inside that Soldiers National Cemetery with very young people, and we talk about the Gettysburg Address and what it means. And this is the Gettysburg Speech Memorial. We didn't get a chance to show that on the film, so I wanted to include this slide. Probably, we think the only monument to a speech, not to Abraham Lincoln himself, but it is to that speech. The entire Gettysburg Address, 272 words, 10 sentences, is on one side of the monument, and the invitation from David Wills to Lincoln to come and to speak and to get his message out to the people who were very tired of war, to the people in the North who could bring a train to Gettysburg and see all this death and destruction, and to speak to the growing Peace Democrat movement of people who were saying, it's too awful, it's too horrible, let's just end the war, separate into two countries, and each country can determine what they want to do in regards to state versus national government, in regards to the expansion of the institution of slavery or the illegality of it. And so he came with a very clear message as to not only why we have to, a very clear message as to why we had to finish the war and win the war to determine what type of country we would be. This is the only known photograph that we have of Lincoln issuing or presenting the Gettysburg Address. He is right here. He's not the man with the top hat. He's right here to a large crowd, and the cemetery was unfinished at that time. This is an old version of the David Wills house on the square. It is open today, and of course, President Lincoln. And finally, we have some of the consequences directly as a result of the Civil War, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the United States Constitution, making slavery illegal. No state shall make or enforce any law shall abridge the privileges of citizens in the United States in 1868 with the 14th Amendment, and beginning in voting rights with the 15th Amendment in the year 1870. And so, was the war necessary is the question that we are pondering today. And it's always very interesting to read student essays once they've seen the film and they've gone through the letters and the Gettysburg Address and other primary sources very closely, to kind of support their answer to that question in an essay form, and to have them really exercise those critical thinking skills that we all know are so important to develop in students today. And so I'm going to take off my screen share now so that we can answer any questions. And I see that there are some coming in through Facebook and through here as well. So I'm going to do my best to answer as many as we can. And here's one from Facebook that says, what lessons do you think we can learn, use, and apply from Gettysburg in our current climate of political and social unrest? Wow, what an excellent question. I have thought so much about history and the importance of the study of history over the past year, 2 years, 4 years, 8 years, just ever since I've worked here for the past 22 years. There's always something going on, some broader discussion that makes Gettysburg and the Civil War directly relevant. Look at Elizabeth and Peter Thorne, who were immigrants and fighting for their new country. Immigration is something that comes up all of the time. Look at the idea of state versus national government. That comes into play all of the time. And think of President Lincoln coming and just speaking for two and a half minutes, and knowing that his words would be sent all across the country. You know, the reactions to the Gettysburg Address were also very, we think our media today is so divisive and so partisan. It was at that time as well. Some people said it was, one newspaper called his speech dishwatery utterances. And another newspaper said that speech would live among the annals of men. So there are so many lessons that we can learn from throughout all of history. And I think, as I mentioned, critical thinking, being able to look at media sources and what their intentions are, and what what you're going to believe is one of them. That's the job of the historian, is to look at source material and determine and try to piece together the story based on the reliability of those sources. And that's one thing that comes to mind. I'm going to open up the Q&A. When and how did you decide to use this as a subject? I think you're talking about kind of the focus question. I think we have 10 different virtual field trips here at Gettysburg, and we've tried to develop them for various age groups, and we've tried to develop them based on kind of a what if or a focus question that students can really think about. And I think that this one came about off of a in-person program that we do in the National Cemetery for students, where the students are broken into 10 groups, and each group reads the letters of one soldier buried in the cemetery, and they usually read them graveside, and they come back to the larger group to talk to that larger group and report out and be the voice of that soldier, and to say why he was fighting in this war, why he joined, whether he changed, etc. And it gives students in one class 10 different perspectives, the perspectives on the war from 10 different soldiers buried in that cemetery. And so that's where the basis for our program today, that is based off of a virtual field trip we do for students, has come in. So if anybody else has any other questions, oh, I see another one that must have come in on Facebook. You can type them into the Q&A or on Facebook. What is your favorite place at Gettysburg National Military Park and why? Oh my gosh, we don't have enough time for me to answer that. I'll tell you a couple of things. And I also have some artifacts that I have with me here in the office. Some of my favorite places have to do with the stories around this box. I wonder if any of you know what this box is. This is an amputating kit. It's a reproduction amputating kit. As I mentioned earlier, amputation was the most common surgery over the course of the war. And the doctors and the nurses, oh my gosh, they worked so hard And they unfortunately are remembered by history as butchers, as working in the Dark Ages, as not knowing anything at all. And when you really get into that subject, you understand that that is not the truth. Yes, they did not know about germs and that germs carry disease, but they were learning all of the time. And we benefit even today from things that they learned, the triage process, and reconstructive surgery is something that was begun in the Civil War, et cetera, et cetera. And so my favorite places on the battlefield tend to be places that speak to that medical story. So the 32nd Massachusetts Field Hospital site, which was near the wheat field behind 3 large boulders. And there's just an inset in one of those boulders. This is their whole monument to their surgeon, V. Boylston Adams. But things were happening so quickly and so chaotically, he didn't have time to get to a barn or a house, and he set up his field hospital behind those rocks. That's one of my favorite places on the battlefield. And the first Minnesota infantry marker across from the Pennsylvania monument, because of Philip Hamlin that you've met today, who's I feel like I know because I've read through all of his letters. And so anything that has to do with the first Minnesota, I think is really, really interesting. And so many places. And if anybody else has any other questions, I'm happy to answer those. Or if there's anything that you'd like to see that you see in the background here, I'm happy to answer those as well. And I just wanted to, if we don't have any other questions, just wanted to thank everyone for taking the time out to visit us here virtually, and certainly hope that you will take the time to visit us in person as soon as you can. Here comes a question. What would you say is the common theme that links all of the stories and perspectives of the Battle of Gettysburg together? Well, certainly some of the ones that we've heard about, people are, as we alluded to, people were joining based on their beliefs and what they felt, their concepts of freedom and liberty and democracy. And that's something that we hear about in the news today as well. And so, so we had to determine, that's why I concluded with the Lady Liberty at the top of the Soldiers National Monument there in the National Cemetery. What does that mean? The definition of liberty is so different for people. It was certainly different for people back then. That's not to say that everybody who fought for the Union Army, certainly they were not abolitionists. They were not fighting to end slavery personally on a personal level. And the war changed throughout. There was certainly racism in the North as well as in the South. But we were growing as a country, and we had to determine what ideals we believe in. And we're there again. We have to determine what it is that makes us American, and what is the best way to move forward in the best definition of liberty. And the Gettysburg Address does that so well. And so that first sentence of the Gettysburg Address, 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. It's brilliant, because there had always been this tug between when and how our country started. Even Jefferson and Adams had these arguments through letters. Was it with the Declaration of Independence, or was it later on with the Constitution? And Abraham Lincoln is saying right there at the beginning of the Gettysburg Address what he believed, and that was, it began with the Declaration of Independence that clearly stated all men are created equal. And so our progression towards that broadening definition of liberty continues even today. I could go on and on talking about some favorite places here at Gettysburg. Certainly all you out there who have been here probably know about Sally the dog, and on the 11th Pennsylvania Infantry Monument. Sally was the mascot to the 11th Pennsylvania Infantry, and she was so dedicated and stayed with the wounded and dead after the first day of the battle until without food and water, so loyal. And I'm a big dog lover, and they were as well. And when they created their monument, they made sure to include Sally right on there. Okay, it is just about 4:54, and I'm going to turn it back to the National History Academy. And once again, I just want to thank everybody for watching. And if you're watching the recording, thank you so much for studying history. And thank you, NHA, for having me on today. I sure did enjoy it.
Well, we just want to thank you so much and say a big thanks to all of our viewers on Facebook, and we look forward to seeing you next week.